But these lectures are really meant to be interactive. We should all feel at ease, relax. I'm not a professional professor, if I may say so. I'm a practitioner. I just finished my job as a diplomat 1 year ago in Washington, as Gunther just mentioned. And I've been posted in all kinds of places. I started in Lebanon in the middle of the civil war, which is a rather interesting experience in terms of the conflict circle that I will be discussing with you at some of the upcoming sessions. Then in Jordan, then in the center of Africa. You know, the Belgian diplomat always has to somehow pass some time in Central Africa because of the past relationship that we had with the colonies over there, Rwanda, Burundi, and Congo. Then I spent some time in Latin America. I've always had a big love for Latin America. That was in Santiago de Chile, which is perhaps the best place all over the Latin world. Then in Brussels, and then later on Washington for the first time, then back to Brussels. Then, then I went to the United Nations and had the kind of exceptional opportunity to serve on behalf of Belgium as a non-permanent member of the Security Council. And that definitely will also be part and parcel of my story, because that is really where you have diplomacy, I would say, in its purest form. And we will particularly speak about that when we have those sessions on negotiation. So that's more or less the person I am. So you see, I am a practitioner in the first place. And that is what brings me to you, and in this place, in this university, before the Brussels Diplomatic Academy, before the Institute of European Studies, throughout my life, although being a practitioner with my 2 feet on earth. Some people say that I have too much my 2 feet on earth, which means that I sometimes can be slightly cynical about political situations. Still, I have always had a keen interest for the underlying concepts. I felt that it was kind of wasting your time just doing something without reflecting and thinking about what you are doing. And that is what brings me to this place. So I'm pleased to be here. Let me just give a very short preview of what we will be covering. As Gunther said, today is a kind of introductory session where we will kind of explore the question, what is diplomacy? Now, there is no single definition, and looking for a definition doesn't even make sense. I try to explain that. There are so many avenues, approaches, perspectives in which you can approach that question that it doesn't mean anything to ask the big question, what is diplomacy, with the single, unique answer, diplomacy is. But we'll explore. We go around and we see that it's a multifaceted issue. But one of the most important distinctions within that definition will be concepts, that is the study of diplomacy, and practice, that is what does a diplomat concretely do? Negotiating, speaking in public, speech writing, and all that kind of things. We'll come back to that. But these are the kind of 2 main pillars of the sessions to come. So the first pillar, the kind of conceptual pillar, is the one where we will start next week, next session. Today is exploration. Next session with a very large, what I call macroscopic view, very comprehensive way of looking at the world, as if the world was just there, some place over there, and we'll just walk around the world and try to find out what are today the main characteristics of that world from a political point of view. Or to put it in another way, we're going to try to identify the underlying trends, the strategic underlying currents, and where it may prospectively lead us. And I find that I found that, and that's of course, that was part of my job, but one of the most rewarding things you can do as a diplomat, that is just try to find out what the underlying trends are. So many diplomats are just looking at events, and they are so excited about events. Something happened, a main clash between two countries, a main summit where two people agreed, whereas everybody thought they would not agree. These are events. What you have to do is go underneath the events and try to look for currents. And as you will see next time, there are quite significant currents which you can label in quite, one-liners. First, 2, 3. We're going to go through 7 of them. So that's for the next lecture. What is this world about? Once we have covered that we kind of know how to go about that world, we'll start with what I think is the core of diplomacy. The core of diplomacy is peace and security. Whatever you can say about economic diplomacy, energy diplomacy, I'll come back to that. But the core of diplomacy is, of course, managing international relations, managing interstate relations. But the core is peace and security. In the past, they spoke about war and peace. For those who are familiar a little bit with international relations and international public law, Hugo Grotius was one of the big 16th century thinkers about international relations, and he wrote, as a matter of fact, the first handbook in international law, and that was Juris ac Pacis. Juris ac Pacis et Bellum, the law of war and peace. Just to show you that historically also was kind of the bedrock of the core of diplomacy. And because of that, the 2 next sessions, that is session 3 and session 4, will be focusing on the conflict cycle, what we call the conflict cycle. And the conflict cycle kind of starts here with what we call preventive diplomacy. And we go up then, we don't really succeed in preventing a potential conflict. We call that the dispute angle, as long as a dispute doesn't go over in an open conflict. We talk about disputes. So we have preventive diplomacy. There is a dispute going on. It exacerbates, and then it goes over. We are close to an open conflict. We try to bring in ultimate negotiations, mediations, and then when all options have been exhausted, there is a war that starts. And that's the conflict proper. And then once the conflict is over, you start in what we call the post-conflict cycle. That is, first of all, finding a short-term arrangement, a ceasefire. Then finding out the beginning of a peace agreement, with perhaps the beginning of constitutional arrangements, but not a peace accord proper, some understanding, a memorandum of understanding, something like rather fluid. In the meantime, we have to handle questions of justice, what we call transitional justice. The problem of the reason why we find out about transitional justice is that the people who fought are exactly the people we need to make peace. So you cannot simply put them in jail and say, you were a bad guy, and there you are. We need them to construct a peace because they stand for a lot of people behind them. So these are questions, all questions, which you find in the post-conflict era, and more you start doing peace building, and then institution building, rehabilitation, reconciliation of the people, rehabilitation of the country itself. That's the conflict cycle. And we'll do that part and that part in one session. But that part I didn't cover yet, and that's the war proper. And we give one session to that, not just war, but armed conflict in general. And there I will try to bring you 2 questions, basically. The question of legality and the question of legitimacy. They're distinct questions. You can have a legal title to enter into war. That means legally you're allowed to do it. And we will exactly spell out what the legal rules are. But that doesn't make it legitimate. Perhaps you're just wrong in the kind of war you're going to install. And in that connection, they make sometimes a distinction between wars of necessity and wars of choice. George W. Bush first Gulf War was a war of necessity. You remember when he entered into Kuwait. That was a war of necessity. But the Iraq War, the George W. Bush son, 20 years later, that was a war of choice. That was not really necessary. And we've seen all the consequences of having handled that war, that not necessary war, that war of choice, in a bad way. So we will explore all these things. We'll see, for instance, what the difference is between a preemptive action and a preventive action. Preemptive actions, I just tell you that at this stage, we'll go into details later. A preemptive action is one that just before a potential conflict breaks out, kind of neutralizes the conflict by preemptively acting. This is always legitimate as far as a self-defense measure, always legitimate. You don't have to go to legal, you don't have to go through the Security Council. Preventive war, preventive actions, on the contrary, are as a rule illegal, but we'll come back to that. But these are the kind of concepts that we will go through. So that was session number 4. And then we shift hats, and from the more, I would say, not theoretical, I never will be theoretical, proper, but the more conceptual tour, we'll shift then to the practical tour. That's the diplomat who drives up his, starts working, negotiation, mediation, speaking in public, interacting with an aggressive, assertive press, speech writing, speech delivery, two totally different things. So many speeches, when delivered, are bad because they have been written not as a speech to be spoken, but as a text to be read. And so that kind of schizophrenic situation are things that I am willing to share with you, how to overcome all that kind of things. Perhaps some words also on writing down a report. How do you make a report? How do you draft a resolution, be it a resolution of the Security Council, be it a resolution of a General Assembly, whatever. So these are the more practical issues, but of course the stress will be on negotiation and all the tactics that you can employ, but not just tactics, everything you have to care for in order to be an effective negotiator. And we'll sum that up in what I call the 10 golden rules of the effective negotiator. And this then is for the last 2 sessions. So that's a short overview of what we're going to do. Now, let's start with that question that is before us for today, and that is, what is diplomacy? And as I told you, it's an exploratory exercise. We'll pick and choose some concepts as we go along. But I also would like to tell you that this, in general, I will try to make sure that there is something like 20 minutes for you, Q&A. Experience has demonstrated that that is very often the most interesting time, because then your questions are being addressed properly. Of course, I try in my introductions and in my presentations to anticipate what your interests are. I hope I'm not talking to another audiences than the one who is here, but still I may be missing some important points, and then for you to raise them. So I try to keep disciplined in that respect. So in less than an hour, you will have the floor. Now, I would like to start with an extremely simple exercise. I just brought some cuts from the Financial Times of today. And the point I try to make, I have to stick to this place also. Normally I like to go around. The point that I would like to make is just to show you how proximate diplomacy is to all of us, how close it is. Just open the newspaper and you will find a couple of points, and these are not little points. These are not little points. These are very fundamental points, and I go over them. I flare of them. I'm not going to give an in-depth analysis at this stage. This will be much more for next time. But the first one I have here is Xi's power shapes confident China's long-term strategy. So you know that the Congress is going on in Beijing, The whole question is, what kind of China will emerge out of that Congress? This is a very important question because we are currently living in a time of uncertainty, unpredictability, a time of flux and fluidity, a time of confusion, a time of strategic unease. I just took those concepts because these are the concepts you heard here in the community, in universities, in think tanks, in the press. These are the recurring terminologies to qualify the time. And this, of course, is part of that strategic unease. Where are we heading? Power shift is, in fact, perhaps the best summary of the times we are living in. The power is shifting. You all see that. With Obama and now Trump, clearly the power of the United States is slightly diminishing. We should never exaggerate. I will stress more than once during those 6 hours or 6 or 8 hours that we will meet that the job of a diplomat is, contrary to the journalist, to de-dramatize. And the world, and this I want to stress, the world is a much simpler place than many let us it appear to be, particularly journalists. Journalists, of course, they are always looking for the emotional, the sentimental, the exaggerate, the inflate. A diplomat is somebody who tries to put all this in order, and at the end of the road, at the end of the day, he basically says, look, of course this is as simple as it is. There is a certain banality, perhaps not in life, but in international life. But I'll come back to that. So that's China, and nobody will question that indeed the whole power struggle among the emerging powers, China, the de-emerging powers, US, Europe, still not well defined on the international scene. Soft power, hard power, we don't know, but we'll come back to that. Belarus. Belarus seeks stronger ties with the European Union. Lukashenko, he was sanctioned 10 years ago. We lifted sanctions a couple of months ago because he let out the political prisoners, because the last elections in 2015 went the right way, and he is now re-establishing a kind of relationship with us, with the European Union, looking for new ties with the European Union. But, if you read the article, while maintaining his relationship, of course, with Russia, which has that kind of neighborhood policy that we are well familiar with, but also China. So I'm pointing here to the kind of balancing act that many play. Never put all your eggs just in one single basket. Try to diversify your alliances, your friends, and perhaps foes. So Belarus. Now I come to a real one. This one is US allies step up pressure on North Korea. And I will read you one single phrase because there is one single adjective there which is politically and diplomatically a very important adjective. I read. Japan's defense minister, that's the ally, said North Korea's nuclear and missile programs pose an imminent danger as US allies step up their warning about the rogue state's rapidly increasing military capacity. There is also an art of reading. This definitely has been written by a journalist who knows his stuff. Or better, the Minister of Defense, because this is a statement made by the Minister of Defense of Japan. He knows what vocabulary to use. You've seen here that North Korea's nuclear and missile programs pose an imminent danger. Now, the concept of an imminent danger, we speak about an imminent threat, is a very fundamental one. Because when you face an imminent threat, then I come back to my preemptive and preventive, then you are in the category of the preemptive. When you face an imminent, and sometimes they also say proximate threat, then you are allowed to trigger a preemptive action. Most people say strike, but strike is just one modality of doing an action. So this is not gratuitous. This is close reading here, tells you, be careful, imminent danger. But now I come to another point. I reread the sentence. It's almost like Bible exegesis that we are starting to do. I reread the sentence. And please be careful. I stress another word this time. Japan's defense minister has said North Korea's nuclear missile programs pose an imminent danger, comma, as US allies step up their warnings about the rogue state's rapidly increasing military capacity. Now, as US allies step up their warnings about the rogue state, there is so an indication there that Japan is not alone here, that Japan is in a group of nations that may start having those same concerns about an imminent threat, and that also the US's responses to the current situation in North Korea perhaps make more intense, heighten that imminent threat. In other terms, the fact that Mr. Trump for the last few weeks has been himself speaking a language that is not really the language of appeasement is implicitly being seen here as part of what renders the threat coming out of North Korea an imminent threat. We can come back to that. But I just want to show you that the world sometimes is intricate and that a threat coming out of a country can sometimes be heightened, augmented, not just by the behavior of that country, but by the fact that another one is threatening that country on its turn. I'll close here. Japanese polls portend constitutional change. Again, a rather fundamental point, because that constitutional change, as you know, Abe now has 2/3 of his parliament. 2/3 is what you need to change the constitution without the opposition being in a position to break your deal. What he wants to do is to revisit the so-called pacification clause and make it a non-pacification clause, if I may say so. I can't say the reverse of pacification, which is militarization. That's not his purpose proper, but at least to end the pacification clause. And the pacification clause basically says that Japan can never trigger any war whatsoever, in any situation whatsoever. So that shows you something about, again, the strategic environment that is changing over there in the world at large, but specifically in the East Asian region, as we qualify the region of China, the two Koreas, and Japan, that is East Asia, that there is a new situation growing there as a result, among others, of what is happening in North Korea. As you know, what China is doing in the South China Sea, we'll come back to that, is also quite disturbing. I go over that one as just Babis, who won the Czech elections, and the whole question is, what kind of person is that going to be? He's probably going to Prime Minister in Prague. Question is, will he be a Viktor Orban and a Kaczynski-like person, Orban, Hungary, Kaczynski, Poland, or will he be different? Crucial question, because we in Europe, as you know, we care about our internal cohesion, which is under some tension lately, among other things because of that migration pressure, in which some countries have not been willing to share the burden, particularly Hungary, Poland, Slovakia to some extent, and now potentially Czechia. So this is just a short demonstration that diplomacy is very close to us. It's near to us. It's something that every day we kind of have to deal with. Now let's tackle that more broad question about what diplomacy is in fact. I already told you, it's a very broad question, and therefore you can give all kinds of answers. You can give elegant answers such as diplomacy is the management of relations between independent states by the process of negotiations. That's the kind of textbook definition what you can find in those boring courses that you have to study all over the place. And then you have the kind of inelegant, allow and answer, which is diplomacy is the art of saying nice doggy until you can find a rock. Okay, you kind of know that kind of statements. But what you see, you have a high end and a low end. It's a broad, broad spectrum. And I think you have to take it for what it is. It's a broad spectrum. It covers a lot. And that's the way it is. So let's not narrow it down to one single definition, which in fact is unfaithful to what it really is. Now, to start the discussion, to find our way in that jungle, let me first say that there are, I think, three fundamental methodological approaches which are quite different. The first one, and I go fast through this because I think most of us, you are familiar with that, is what I call descriptive diplomacy. That's my name. Descriptive diplomacy, that is, in fact, what you know as international relations. I think some of you have attended an international relations course, and you know how that goes very often. I'm not talking about international relations theory. International relations course, in fact, it's a kind of reflective history of diplomacy. Take Kissinger, his big book called Diplomacy, a fantastic work, but it's basically history. It's the history of the relations among the nations over 2-3 centuries. But it's reflective history. It's not just events, an accumulation of events and dates and congresses and treaties. It's a reflective way, but still a way of walking through history. That's what I call descriptive diplomacy. That's the kind of standard way people bring diplomacy. My first course ever in diplomacy was that kind of course, descriptive diplomacy. The second one is what I would call normative diplomacy. Normative diplomacy, that is not so much what is out there in the world, what happened through history, what should we do, the kind of exercise we're going to do next week when we wrap up that kind of bird's-eye view on the world. Normative diplomacy is rather not how is the world, but how should the world be? And therefore, how should we, diplomats, how should we act? What are the norms and standards that we are supposed to obey to respect? And that brings you very close to international law, and more specifically, international public law. International public law, in fact, is just the set of all the norms that somehow regulate international life. But again, I don't think this approach, the normative approach, properly reflects what diplomacy is. It's part of the game. And for instance, when you sit in the Security Council, you'd better know exactly what is in the UN Charter, because people play with those rules, Article 33, paragraph 2, Article 51, self-defense article, Article 1/7, the right of the duty of non-interference, non-intervention in domestic affairs and so on. So, of course, as a diplomat, you have to know a lot of international public law, because these are the rules which tell you how it should be. But diplomacy is, of course, more than just the question of norms and standards. A third approach then, and I think that's going to be a little bit my approach, is what I call analytical diplomacy. But we're still in the study of diplomacy. How do you study? I study it through history, descriptively. I study it through law, normatively. I study it through concepts. And that's what I would call analytical diplomacy. And that, I think, is the purest form of doing the study of diplomacy. I hasten to say that this is not the same as international relations theory. I don't know whether any of you is familiar with theory as such. This, I think, I've read a couple of those books, and just recently one pretendedly outstanding book, which is being used in quite some universities. I think the level of abstractness of those theories is such that you really just wonder whether we are talking about the same thing, that is diplomacy. But there it is. That's just a personal qualification of most of the books on theory. Some of them are rather good. And I will say something later on in this lecture about at least two strands of thought, which all of us, we have to keep in mind in order to attend the other classes, knowing exactly that you have two models about how to look at diplomacy. But I come back to that. So we had descriptive, normative, analytical. I kind of feel that analytical is important, but that's the study of diplomacy. That is what I called earlier the first pillar. We are going to look at diplomacy, the conflict cycle, the use of force and that kind of things. That's a rather conceptual exercise. The second exercise I told you is the practical question. What does a diplomat actually do? He's a negotiator, he's an analyst, he's a problem solver and that kind of things. And that is what I would call the approach of diplomatic practices. And now look, I'm not inventing or reinventing the wheel. Ask the question, what is medicine? You will have the same distinction. Some people will say medicine is the study of anatomy, physiology, traumatology, obstetrica, and what have you. And another will say, well, medicine, that's simply what the doctor does. So the same approach can be used for what is diplomacy. Diplomacy is what a diplomat does. And let's go through the list of what a diplomat does. Well, first of all, he's the analyst. Next week, when we look at the world as if it was a little ball that we can inspect from different angles, that's the analysis. That's the analyst. How does this world look like? What are the underlying trends and tendencies? Bipolar, unipolar world, multipolar world. We'll come back to that on later. Second, the diplomat is not just the analyst. You can make a fantastic analysis, but then the question is, so what? Very interesting. Intellectual stuff. Nice thoughts, but what do I do with it? So beyond the analysis, there is the policy shaper, the guy who answers the question. So that is, therefore, what we should do. He draws the policies. The minister will decide for the country, because the minister is accountable to the parliament. That's another logic. Therefore, the minister may not necessarily go to the best option that you as a diplomat present before him, because he has to be responsive to imperatives which are different from yours. But your job is to make a fair analysis and to make the right recommendations to your minister, perhaps under the form of options, because you're not blind and you kind of anticipate upon the constraints that are those of your minister. And therefore, you will not bring him an option that you utterly know it is not feasible. It will never get off the ground. It will never fly. So a good policy shaper is one, what should I do about it? What is to be recommended ideally? And what is feasible in the facts? That's the policy shaper. Once you have your policy, you have to work out a strategy. A policy basically says, that is more or less the end terms that we should be reaching at. A strategy is, how do I get from here to there? You work out a strategy. This can take a lot of different forms, but very often you can simply do that like a tree, you know. You have two options, I go for this one, then again 2 options, I go for that one. You work at strategy, but that's really a long-term exercise. That's the end term that you know you want to reach because you made your policy assessment. You know that that is where you want to land. Your strategy tells you how to go from your starting point up to there. That's the diplomat as a strategist. Then you have the diplomat as a tactician. The tactician says, look, I know what road you're going to handle, but now the question is, how exactly are we going to do? Are we going to take a bus or a car, a bicycle, and what have you? This is the tactical approach that you have to work out in order to get through your strategy. Whereas your strategy is long-term, LT, your tactics are short-term, ST. And you revisit them according to changing circumstances. Diplomat is also a problem solver. Along the road, you find all kinds of little problems, not necessarily big problems. Your big problems have been addressed by your problem-solving strategy, tactics, but all kinds of little problems such as granting of visas, for instance. I've been chief of staff of the minister for quite a few years. I can tell you the number of times that I had to solve problems of visa for Mr. Bemba. Perhaps some of you are familiar with Bemba. Bemba was one of those people who fought against Kabila in Congo, the Democratic Republic of Congo. Was not an easy thing because he was basically somebody who had infringed all basic rules of humanitarian law and that kind of things, but we needed him. I spoke about transitional justice. He had to come to Brussels for meetings and that kind of things. So that's the problem solver. The negotiator, we come back to that later on. That's what the diplomat does. So the diplomat, he studies, conceptual, analytical, he acts. When we kind of make those studies, particularly not so much the acting side, the negotiation side and so, but when many of those problems, when you study them, I think in a kind of modern approach of what is diplomacy about, that we should have a kind of interdisciplinary approach. That is, you can easily rely upon a lot of sciences or branches of sciences that are very often overlooked, particularly in the study of diplomacy. Once you are in the sphere of social sciences, and perhaps to some extent political science, some of these elements are taken up. But in the study of diplomacy, I personally have never met anything, well, perhaps a few exceptions at the School of Chicago, but anything which resembles the little list that I set here. And I go through it. Decision theory, acting under uncertainty, expected utilities, and all that kind of stuff. There is a lot to be learned out of decision theory for doing diplomacy and kind of conceptualizing what diplomacy is about. Game theory, well, you are all familiar, I take it, with the prisoner's dilemma. But that's just one of the games. You have chicken. You have dictator's game, which is very relevant for diplomacy. Dictator's game is when one has overwhelming power of another in a game situation. So the other has, in fact, no option whatsoever to win. But the dictator, the one who is potentially, of course, setting the terms of, the debate, of the negotiation, I can set the terms of negotiation. But because I will need you in the future, we have to do business later on. You're another country, I'm country A, you're country B. I've kind of want to give you a margin of, respite, respectability. I don't want to crush you totally. And so that is one of those games, the dictator game. It's called the dictator game. Don't go up to the end where you could go. You have the power to leave the other with zero payoff, as we call it in game theory, and you go out with the 10 points payoff. Leave him 2, 3 points so that he's not utterly humiliated and that you can act with him later on. Just to give you this as an example, that's one of the games being studied in game theory. You can draw really quite some advantage of game theory. Discourse theory, for those who are familiar, Jürgen Habermas, Michel Foucault, and so on. Communicative action, formal pragmatics, that's particularly interesting in negotiation, argumentation, and so on. I don't think I will say a lot on that once we are there, but I just wanted to draw your attention. Discourse theory, a lot to be learned. Discourse theory, just to give you one example, when you enter a negotiation situation, you should be aware that this is not just about knowing the topic, knowing what you're talking about, and then making, the right rational arguments. It's also a question of being totally aware about the context in which you're operating. Who is who? Which are the sensibilities of what? How do I conduct? A negotiation is in fact a kind of sophisticated form of conversation. And all of us, when we have a conversation with each other, we are answerable to a lot of unspoken rules. You're probably not even aware about all those kinds of little underlying rules that play a role, a significant role, whenever you are doing a conversation with another person or a conversation in a small group. Well, that is what discourse theory is bringing out. Now, in a conversation, at the corner in the street with one of you, it's not very important to know all those underlying rules. But when you are in a negotiation situation, you better know what kind of underlying rules there are. We sometimes say in French, les non-dits, the non-said, all those kind of implicit understandings that play a role. Perhaps we'll say something when we are at the session on negotiations. Social psychology, stereotypes, cliches, the good guys, the bad guys, the xenophobic discourse and all that kind of racism, xenophobism, all this is very close. Well, lessons of social psychology can easily be used there. Cultural anthropology, understanding the mind of the other. I will have to say a lot on that, because in a negotiation situation, for instance, if you want to effectively negotiate, the first thing you have to do is to understand the mind of your, we don't say enemy in a negotiation situation, we say the antagonist. You're the protagonist, and that is the antagonist. Enter in his mind. Try to find out why he's making the statements he's making. And you will, I assure you, you will find out that there is a much more rationality in the other's minds than you think in the negotiation situation. You can be easily dismissive, particularly when the cultural gap is large. You can be easily tempted to be dismissive of the position of an antagonist simply because you overlook what his internal logic is. And these internal logics can be quite different. There is a little book, and at some stage I'll give you a little list about some books which are, I think, interesting. It's called The Geography of Mind. Already the title is a good one. Professor Nisbet from Georgetown University, Washington, where I was until a couple of months ago. And Geography of Mind. And basically what he does is kind of make a contraposition between the Western mind, say the European, American mind, the transatlantic mind, if you wish, and the Asian mind, particularly the Chinese mind. And there are big differences there. There is, for instance, the individualism of us versus the collectivism of Asia. This is not an invention of the communists. Some people say, yeah, I know. The Stalinist program of Mr. Xi Jinping is a communist program, and therefore he's a collectivist. Nothing to see. It's linked to Confucianism and that kind of things. So individualism, we are individuals. Look at the French Revolution. Look at the American Revolution. It's the person, the individual, who constructs bottom-up society. In China, it's top-down. It's top-down. Hierarchy, for instance, is typically Asian value, whereas we have more kind of, you know, what some people call heterarchy, the extreme of which is anarchy. We are single atoms, and we construct our own molecule, whereas up there it's top-down. So universalism versus particularism. Universal values, that's typical for us. With the French Revolution, with the Enlightenment, we started having universal values, particularly the human rights, fundamental freedoms, political freedoms. In Asia, that's not the way they look at it. They have what we call particularism. We'll come back to that. But you can easily understand that when you are discussing with people and you have those differences in the mindset, it's not just posturing, it's not optical, it's really in the mind, in the GNA, in the DNA. You can easily understand that the misunderstanding is rapidly there. Take the debate on human rights. You certainly will have covered that in other courses, but human rights is a very touchy thing. And they tell us, the others, the Chinese, the Asians generally, tell us that it is a Western concept coming out of Enlightenment, and that we are ethnocentric, thinking that our values are ipso facto the universal values. Then, of course, you can raise your hand and you say, but the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, United Nations. But at what time was that done? That was done at the time that we were about with 56. The 51 guys who were in San Francisco setting up the United Nations, plus some other who have joined, but the bulk, today we are with 194 members of the United Nations, the bulk of those guys was not there. And the bulk of those guys were the colonies, were exactly the Asian countries and the African countries and the Latin American countries that were not taken up in the exercise. I'll come back to that. So the point I'm making here is those sciences, those branches of sciences, decision theory, game theory, discourse theory, social psychology, cultural anthropology, and behavioral economics. I don't know whether you're familiar with that, but I definitely invite you to Google tonight behavioral economics. Last week you may have seen that Thaler, T-H-A-L-E-R, won the Nobel Prize as being the instigator, the father, the spiritual, intellectual father of behavioral economics. That is very interesting for diplomacy, because behavioral economics, basically in one sentence, it is that branch of economy that says the premise of classical economics, namely a rational man, that is a man with a consistent set of preferences out of which he makes decisions, confrater decision theory where I started, that a rational man is the basic underlying premise of classical economics. Now, many people found out that men, the real man, you and me, we are not rational at all. On the contrary, we are extremely influenced by all kinds of trends and things, inputs which come on us. And this gives rise to what they call cognitive traps. And most of us fall in those traps. And if you fall in those traps in diplomacy, you're making mistakes. And mistakes which can end up in a rather unpleasant situation that is a dispute, a conflict, or whatever. Cognitive traps. Just one example, that's what they call the endowment effect. When you have something, you value that thing much more than when you do not have it. Let's say that we go shopping, we see that a bottle of wine is worth 60 euros. I take a very good bottle, 60 euros. And then we go. Next time, I pass the shop and I say, well, that bottle of 60 euros, I want to have it. I take it, I go home, and then I see my friend and say, well, look, I bought a bottle. Would you be interested in buying it? And he says, yeah, in fact, I was also contemplating buying it, but the guy has only one left. So I'll give you a slight premium, and then it goes up to much more, over 10, 20% that he has to give before the buyer, that is me, the owner, leaves the bottle. That is what they call the endowment effect. The mere fact that you own something makes you value that thing much more than when you were not the owner of the thing. That is also why there is risk aversion and loss aversion. To lose $100 gives you much more pain than the happiness you have or gain when you gain $100. Losing $100, it's really painful, my God. Winning $100, all right, it's a good day, pleasant, but not the kind of same intensity and graded pleasure commensurate to the unhappiness that you got from losing the $100. So look at that, endowment effect, and you have all kind of other effects. And the point I'm making now is it's interesting to look at that because it helps you better understand how diplomacy works, among other things, because behavioral economics obviously has been applied in the first place in economy itself. Now let me briefly address two other questions, and I see that time is running fast. So diplomacy, again, we kind of try to find it from different perspectives. The first perspective was, is it descriptive, is it normative, is it analytical? The second kind of approach was, no, let's take it just for what a diplomat does, what I call the diplomatic the practices, simply the practices of the diplomat. That is what counts. Let's now try another approach and do it by way of asking the what question and the how question. So the what question, I already hinted to that, the kind of elegant, noble way of saying what is the subject matter of diplomacy is, as I said, it's the management of the international, perhaps interstate relations. All right, that's very nice. At the core, peace and security, what they call war and peace at the time, and therefore conflict cycle. I already went over there. It's a question of making sure that there is coexistence, peaceful coexistence among the nations. But peace and security does encompass much more than just the questions about war and peace. And that is what we have to understand under the what question. What comes in? Well, basically, as I suggested, almost everything can be subsumed in one way or another under diplomacy. There are therefore a multiplicity of diplomacies. But I warn you not to go too far and not to stretch the concept too far in either direction. There is something like economic diplomacy. Gunther Gaublaume mentioned it, that this school, the Brussels Diplomatic Academy, focuses a lot on economic diplomacy. That's a legitimate thing, particularly from a diplomatic point of view, when we start talking about geoeconomics. Geoeconomics, that is what we currently see with the so-called Silk Road project, the Belt and Road initiative from the Chinese, which is really a macro investment stretching from China up to Europe, including the British Isles. So this is a project. It is an economic project, but the underlying objectives are from a geopolitical nature, and that is why we call it geoeconomics. Now, that's not really that new. A lot of people say that's totally new, that's a new concept, that's the concept of the future, geoeconomics and so on. I don't think we can really label that as being revolutionizing. Just think about what happened in Europe after the Second World War, where we had the Marshall Plan. For all practical purposes, the Marshall Plan was a geo-economic project. something that was in fact the incentive for us to make sure that we made peace in Europe after the 2 civil wars that we went through, First World War, Second World War. Leaders all over the world, and particularly our American friends, were very scary that there should be, after the second, a third one, and therefore invested a lot of attention in Europe, making sure that we would find peace and security for the long term. The whole European construction finds, as many of you know, finds its origin in that, avoiding that there should be a third world war. But the Americans saw that even though we had had a Second World War, that we were still fighting a lot and discussing a lot about what concept of, collaborative enterprise, the European Union, the then economic community, would be. And therefore the Americans said, look, we'll give you an incentive. If you properly behave, you get some funds. And that was the Marshall Plan. So, but that's clearly, the story I tell you is a political story. So it shows you that you can do economics, but for underlying political, in this case, geopolitical reasons. So that's economic diplomacy. Then we have environmental diplomacy, climate change and all that kind of things. Some people call that eco-diplomacy, if you want to give it a nice title. You have energy diplomacy, particularly in Europe. The whole relationship of dependency or non-dependency, particularly with the Russians over there. You have seen how the Russians have used the weapon of energy to put pressure on Moldova, on Ukraine, and many other countries. You have health diplomacy, the epidemics, viruses like Ebola 2 years ago in Sierra Leone and Liberia. You have population diplomacy. Rwanda is a good example. Many people, many analysts point to the fact that it was overpopulation and demographic pressure that were the first trigger of those awful genocides that we were witnessing in March 1994. Okay, Egypt, Chad, and what have you. Now, I gave you a whole list about economic diplomacy, eco-diplomacy, energy diplomacy, health diplomacy, population diplomacy. You can easily understand that you can continue cyber diplomacy. Therefore, I want to make a caveat. And the caveat is, let's not exaggerate, because if you go that way, everything becomes diplomacy, and therefore diplomacy is nothing anymore. My personal recommendation, but it's a personal one, is keep it rather stringent and close to everything which is peace and security. That's the core job. Don't forget that diplomats have to be responsive as their politicians to what lives in society, and that very often they come out with new concepts, in fact, new labels, just because it sounds well. Eco-diplomacy, what a nice term. And just by coming out with that kind of term or nice terminology, you kind of soften the pill of your adversary or the population at large of civil society or the non-governmental organizations who are asking, please pay attention to environmental diplomacy. Then you call it eco-diplomacy. You open a conference in Brussels, La Grande Conférence sur l'éco-diplomatie, and there you are, everybody. So don't be misled by that kind of labeling politics, and that happens a lot. That's rhetorics. Rhetorics in politics is important. And so just a cautionary note. That was the what question in the third approach, what question. Then you have the how question. That is, how do I do diplomacy? Not, I know the field on which I'm working, interstate relations, but how do I approach that? And then you have different approaches and different instruments. I go over that. We certainly, next week, will have the possibility to go in more detail. Basically, you have a couple of models. You have the competitive versus cooperative model, and then you find that back in, for instance, containment versus engagement. You remember Iran before we started the nuclear negotiations. There were basically two schools engaged with Iran so that we can bring them back on the right path, if I may say so. And then there was the containment policy, Bush, before Obama, Bush, who said, no, you have to pressure them, contain them, pressure them up to a point where they will say, look, okay, we stop our program of nuclear development and ballistic development. Engagement is more, let's talk it over. It's a more European approach, particularly a Belgian approach. We Belgians, we are very strong in talking it over. We always find a compromise, which is, there are reasons for that. As you know, we live in a complex country, so all of us, as of a young age, have lived through those periods where regions and communities and linguistic entities had to bridge building exercises in order to overcome our problems, and that makes Belgium so much a place of compromise. Discussions, talking it over, negotiation, mediation is really in the genetic pattern of the Belgian diplomats and Belgian politicians. Let me give an example, the Catalan issue. You know that our Prime Minister in Belgium was the only one who showed some sympathy with the Catalan cause, not for the substance, not for the independence proper, because he said, no, the Spanish constitution has to be respected. But he made a remark and said, this does not justify disproportionate use of violence. We'll come back to that. Principle of proportionality is a very important principle in diplomacy as well. But the main point he made is, you should dialogue, speak with each other, the Catalans and the Spanish. And that is a typical Belgian remark. Talk it over. We never knock each other. We always talk it over. We take a beer and try to get over whatever problem. And the fact that he was the only one, I think, reflects that kind of very deeply entrenched, almost genetically programmed sense of compromise that we Belgians have. This is just a footnote. All right, competitive versus cooperative, containment, engagement, unilateral, multilateral, that's of course a very important methodological way of doing diplomacy. Unilateral means basically, I'll tell you how to do it. Bilaterally means let's talk it over, just the two of us. Then you have plurilaterally, minilaterally, multilaterally. Let's again not lose ourselves in those gadgets, those newfound terminologies. I just discovered them only a couple of weeks ago, but the new terminology is now unilateral is clear. Bilateral, we all know what that is. That's standard language. Minilateral, look, I'm not quite sure that everybody knows what that means. Plurilateral, that sometimes happens, particularly with respect to trade agreements, which means plurilateral means a group of countries, but not a large group of countries. And then multilateral diplomacy, of course, that's multi, that's many. For instance, the United Nations clearly is a multilateral organization. The World Health Organization, WTO, all these are multilateral organizations and multilateral ways of doing diplomacy. These are approaches. And then there are the instruments. How do you do? Again, I'm with the how question. How do I go about my job? First thing is, again, talking, speaking, conferring, from small talk to mega symmetry, the big conferences like the UN summits on this SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals in 2005, and then again 2 years ago in 2015. These are big summits. That's about the top of how you can confer with each other. But then, of course, you have the small talk, what we call in the diplomatic language, the tête-à-tête. Why are there so much French terms in the diplomatic language? Because until 1960, French was the language of diplomacy, including here in Brussels. I sat not yet in those rooms, but I sat in those rooms as of late 70s, and at that time, the texts were coming out in the first place in French, only later in English, and then in German. We worked with 3 languages. In the Coreper, I mean. For those who are familiar with the European structure, the Coreper is the meeting of the ambassadors in between the working groups and the Council of Ministers. And that is why we speak about tête-à-tête. A tête-à-tête means a confidential interaction between 2 people away from public diplomacy, perhaps secret diplomacy. There can be secret diplomacy. But just to tell you the spectrum of what there can be under the label conferring with each other. Messaging, of course, again, messaging can go through private channels, and again, it can be secret, confidential, but you can also do what we call today public diplomacy, that is, go public and reach out with a view of having the maximum impact possible on your potential audience. Negotiation, I already spoke about that, which is kind of sophisticated kind of conversation. Mediation facilitation, we'll come back to that. Mediation facilitation is slightly different from negotiation. Mediation means that you mediate between 2 parties. Negotiation is that you yourself are one of the parties in the dispute, whereas mediation means there are 2 parties there, but apparently they don't get connected. So I will mediate them and making sure that they come together. But then you have nuances. A facilitator is not really a mediator. Then you have also third-party offer of services, but we'll come back to that. And then, of course, yeah, the ultimate means of conducting diplomacy is the point where diplomacy ends, where diplomacy fails. And that is where you start exercising constraint and coercion. You have recourse to coercion, and you start deterring the other party. And for instance, one of the means of doing that, that is what we call the threat of use of force. It's not use of force yet. It's the threat of use of force. And one classical example is sanction policies. And as you know, the sanctions policies are being decided by the Security Council in New York. Sanction policy is working with a disincentive. You may know, I come back to my loss aversion cognitive trap. You may know that in diplomacy, as far as the threat of use of force, that is coercion, is concerned, we much more work with sanctions regimes than the reverse. We much more work with disincentives than incentives. And the reason we do that is not because we are nasty people, but simply because, for the reasons I told you, a disincentive has much more impact than an incentive. If I give a disincentive, I take again my bottle of wine of 60 euros. If I give a disincentive of 60 euros, that is, you'll pay 60 euros, that pains much more than if I give a positive incentive of, I'll give you $60 when you behave properly. And that is why disincentives and sanctions regimes are being used in diplomacy much more than the kind of positive counterpart of disincentives, and that is what we call, of course, incentives. And then, of course, once the threat of force, what we sometimes call also deterrence, didn't work out, then you go to the actual use of force. And I already said something on that that has 2 chapters, the legality of the use of force and the legitimacy of the use of force. Now, it is 6:15. I'm more or less at 2/3, perhaps, of what I wanted to cover, but I will now take these 15 minutes with you for a Q&A. Perhaps I'll come back a little bit on some of the points. What I wanted also to share with you, I kind of give a preview on that, tell you something about the two main ways of thinking about international relations. And again, some of you may be familiar with that. It's the school of realism and it's the school of liberalism. The realist is the guy who thinks in terms of power, balance of power, national interest, vital national interest. The world is not a very pleasant place. Don't let yourself fool to the others. It's zero-sum, essentially zero-sum. This is kind of realist vocabulary. Competition, containment. Liberal vocabulary, liberal school, cooperation. We trust. We have a basic trust in the world. He's very skeptical about the world. He thinks basically his point of departure is there is no world government, so there is no monopoly of use of force at the world level. So there is a vacuum. If I don't fill that vacuum first, the others will devour me. That's basically a basic premise of Morgenstern, who is the father of realism. Idealism starts from a much more noble concept about what the world is. I trust the others. I'll engage with them. I'll give them credit for what they potentially can do with them, and we are going to enter into a cooperative relationship. And from that cooperation, it's not going to be a zero-sum game, it's going to be a win-win. And then you tell him, yeah, but look, you with your win-win, you are slightly naive, because there will be free riders around. China, for all practical purposes, has been a free rider for the last 20 years. Just for the last 3, 4, 5 years, China is changing behavior and is shifting from the position of a free rider to becoming a responsible co-player on the international scene. But there they were, the free riders. So the realist says to the liberal, you're being fooled. The others get away. You make sure there is peace in the world. You pay for it. You engage for it. And the others go away with that same peace in the world, but make your life difficult. The Russians, whose only power is the power of nuisance, are essentially free riders in the current thing. I'll come back to that because that needs some nuances, but that's part of what we are going to discuss next week. So these are the two schools. I may come back to that next week, but I won't do it, most probably. And then also, I wanted to tell you something else, and that's basically why I needed this paper. That is that I would like to invite you also to think about diplomatic questions with some scientific underpinnings. You already heard me talking about decision theory, game theory, and that discourse theory, and that kind of things. I think most of us kind of approach diplomacy in much too much, verbose ways. Words, rhetorically ways of making an analysis of diplomatic situations. I think some science and mathematics on it can be useful. And I had here 3 little models, and perhaps I come back to that, because I kind of like that. That is, and think about it at home, we'll see next time when we see each other. Why is a bipolar world, just to use the terminology of the Cold War, why is a bipolar world more stable than a tripolar world, which is more stable than a multipolar world? And as you know, we are evolving towards a multipolar world. There are rather easy reasons, and you can easily put a little mathematical model on that. And that's a little bit that has to see with combinatorics. The second thing that I briefly wanted to review with you is the prisoner's dilemma, because it shows you in such an obvious way how, whereas all of us, we know that by cooperating together, we get a win-win, still we end up as rational agents with a lose-lose, which is at the bottom right of the column. But I'll come back to that. But I stress as rational agents, both I, A, and my opponent, B, we rationally go through a reasoning which brings us from the optimal situation to the worst. And the third model that I wanted to share with you is one, it's a kind of Cartesian. Cartesian coordinates. It's more or less like this. Here you put what I will call governance. Here you put government, all right? Here you put fair weather, and here you put bad weather. So we get more or less this. Governance is something that officials do. People like me, who are not ministers, we govern. We have all kinds of rules to respect. We don't have really much discretionary power. What we are being paid for is our expertise, knowing what the rules are, what the evidence is, how to apply that, and that kind of thing. Well, it's not so mechanical as that, but basically, that is what, let's say, a bureaucrat in the Commission does. He applies the rules, and of course, he can only do that for problems which are not too complicated. That is where the problems get complicated. Where they are not too complicated, let's say business as usual, day-to-day things. That is this area. So, fair enough. When things get really difficult, that's fair weather. Everything's here. When things get really difficult, bad weather, then you necessarily are here. If you let them run by your officials, they will give you the wrong recipes. Because they are law-abiding, rule-abiding little guys who just do what they are allowed to do, and they cannot handle difficult cases. They are not equipped for that. They are experts. So here they do a disaster. And the example I wanted to give to you is the Ukraine deal, which was an utter mistake. An utter mistake, because these Commission people, they were just negotiating with the Ukrainians in Kiev as if they were negotiating once again some little trade, package or fish quota or all that kind of things in which they are very strong. But they have totally underestimated the geopolitical context in which Ukraine was evolving. And I can tell you that we, for instance, we diplomats, Belgian diplomats for that matter, we saw this problem coming. We said, those Commission guys who are negotiating that, don't they look at the big picture? Don't they see that there is a Russia there that is very much dissatisfied with what's happening there? So this was a total mistake. So lesson here is governance people should stick to the rules which are only made for fair weather. This is government. Government people can think out of the box, transcend the rules, and handle difficult cases. And that is what we have seen with the latest crisis, the Euro crisis. The Euro crisis has been solved through methods, through solutions, which were not at all in the toolbox of the treaties or the secondary law, as we call. This was just reinvented. We reinvented chapters of the European construction to face the Euro crisis. Migration, the same thing. This is a hard problem, a difficult problem, for which governments must come in. Migration, you remember, well, you know that even today we are talking about quotas. Now, just think about it. That you do quotas for fisheries questions, that is, you, the Dutch, in the North Sea, you can have a quota of this kind of fish of so many tons a month. The Belgians a little less, the UK a little more, and that. Okay, fair enough. We work with fish quotas, but you don't work with migration quotas. You don't say the Belgians are going to take 190, Hungary 160, Slovakia, a smaller country, so 68. That's not the way we handle that. And that was the original approach of things, and therefore you had to find another way out, and one of the way out was to have a deal with Turkey. So I want you to reflect on that. I may come back to that a little bit later, because I find that a very useful scheme to detect where problems arise and how they arise. That is simply that the right people decide about the wrong issues. Here the right people decide about the right issues, but here this box is also interesting. That is when the not right people decide about easy issues. But I'll come back to that.